hello again. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Gwendolyn, Director of Equity and Inclusion. And this program is 19 Questions, Simon Jock style, so it's a bit modified. This is one of Peggy's programs. I met Peggy McIntosh in San Francisco in May when Simon Jock sent a group of us to the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity. And the program I went to was 19 Questions, where Peggy was there with some colleagues, and what the purpose of the meeting was for you all to create the agenda, or the audience there created the agenda, so that's what we're doing here. So hopefully some of you came with questions because you read the little blurb in the symposium guide. But we will take 19 questions or go for an hour and a half, whichever comes first, right? And really we're reflecting on your experience today during the teach-in, experience during the symposium, and then anything that you might have questions about privilege systems, and its intersection with higher education, and anything else Peggy said, really, if you want to, reflections or questions. So Peggy's going to give us a little bit more of the history about that, and while you're listening, please be thinking of something that you'd like to ask. We've invited Ian and the rest of the parts of the Council for Equity and Inclusion, and some of us may be responding along with Peggy depending on the question, and we'll figure that out democratically on the stage. So can we just introduce ourselves coming down the line?
Hi, I'm Evelyn Fisher. I'm an intern with the Council for Equity and Inclusion, and I'm a senior.
Hello, my name is Sabrina Campbell, and I'm a Bard Academy Residence Director and alumni.
I'm Ian, Provost and alumni.
I'm Peggy McIntosh, outsider, guest, from the Wellesley Centers for Women in Wellesley, Massachusetts.
Hi everyone, I'm Eden Renee. My last name is Hayes. I am faculty in psychology as well as in the academy.
My name is Kathy Ingram. I'm the Director of Alumni and Parent Engagement here, and I'm on the CEI LGBTQ subcommittee.
So you heard from me, I'm Gwendolyn. I'm also an alum.
I'm Nathan. I work in the Provost office, and I'm also an alum.
I teach politics, and I'm this thing called faculty fellow, fellow traveler of sorts, comrade and good days.
Jolly good.
And jolly good. And I should have been an alum.
I developed the 19-question exercise for this reason. I was asked to speak at a school in Pasadena, California. I felt I didn't know the school, I didn't know the students, and I didn't know the area, Southern California. So I said, I will not start to speak until I've heard from 19 of you about something we'd like to see addressed before we leave here. So 19 people spoke about something they'd like to see addressed before we left there, something about inclusiveness or diversity or privilege, and then we had a brief break and I organized my notes and then I gave my talk. So since then, I've been doing it in another way. We will not go for 19 whole questions before responding, but we have a group of people here, all of whom might be interested in responding to anything you raise. So it's voluntary on the part of this panel who would like to speak. We'll just pass the mic back and forth, but we hope to cover 17 areas of interest on your part before we leave each other. Now we won't go on till midnight, so we'll just try to be controlled in our responses.
All right, so the last bit of instruction, or not instruction, just framing is Anna Dwyer has volunteered to hear the question and then repeat it back. So she'll be recording them and then repeating them back to the group. So I know we have some plants, just to be honest and transparent, but does anyone have a question? That they can bring to ask or a reflection?
something you would like to hear addressed in some way before we leave?
We actually had a question from the privilege workshop over there.
So you mentioned,
Who's got the mic?
okay. So you mentioned racism and then underlying racism that we tend to see just in general ways that we treat people. But when you look at the underlying racism, it's just people tend to not accept that sort
doing that. So how do we address that and talk about it in a way that doesn't offend people, but at the same time makes them realize what they're doing?
And can you repeat the question?
My understanding, let me see if I hear you saying that we've been talking a lot about racism and underlying racism, and how do we address racism if people aren't aware or are even in denial of the racism that they hold? Does that paraphrase it pretty well?
Yeah, how can we do it without offending them? And how do we reveal their underlying racism without...
Or help them to recognize it, or even to address it?
Peggy's asking me to respond to something I told her before about the way that I teach privilege in my classroom, in a workshop, regardless of the situation. When I first started teaching about privilege, the most common privilege that we hear about is white privilege. And that can be particularly difficult to hear from a, obviously black woman. So from a black woman, telling people about white privilege, at first students would be very combative about it, and I remember one actually told me, it's exactly like professor privilege, and like, no, it's nothing like professor privilege. Professor, privilege, or being within a particular like class or education level. My education level is something that I went through and I earned, and I worked through. But at the same time, if I was white, then there would probably be easier systems for me to get through the education system. White privilege actually starts at conception. And so I kept going and helping the students understand what's going on. And then I realized what was wrong was really that I started with white privilege instead of starting with my privilege. So now when I teach about privilege, I start with where I'm privileged. So I say, yes, I'm black and I'm a woman. But there are many privileges that I hold. So I am cisgender, I am heterosexual, I am pretty much middle class, I have a certain education level, I'm attractive. Humility is not one of my character traits. It's not. I took a test, it said it was one of the lowest. But those things help to get people to open up their minds a bit before I can get to white privilege. And when I'm in my stereotyping and prejudice class, I give the invisible knapsacks, which is a list of many white privileges, but I give them also what's having to do with male privilege, able-bodied privilege, privilege having to do with religion, and as many lists as I could possibly could find. Actually, there's a thin privilege as well as privilege having to do with being more in the middle in terms of weight, another privilege that I also hold. But by starting with my privileges, I was better able to get people to listen to me in terms of trying to talk about any privilege.
The next question, we're ready for it?
So I guess why does why does lazy USA government folk resort to welfare and affirmative action instead of being not lazy, and like what can we do about it?
To paraphrase that, so my understanding is, why does the government sort of, it sounds like, go with the sort of easy, or use the term lazy response in terms of affirmative action and welfare versus other ways of addressing inequities, I guess. Is that...
I couldn't hear what either of you said. Somebody else on the
I could try to speak even a little bit louder. Would that be helpful?
Yes.
Okay, sure. My understanding of the question is, why does the U.S. government use policies such as affirmative action and welfare as ways of addressing social issues rather than strategies that this questioner would describe as sort of less sort of lazy, a lazy response?
Well, what we have here is a structure, there's been a history in the US of people who have been oppressed, and what that does is, over time, people are then unable to then have the same opportunities as others. So it's basically starting a race, but a little bit behind. And so some of the intentions of affirmative action and of welfare are to kind of help people to get on even levels as other people. So it's this idea of, historically, there have been marginalized groups who may not have the same capabilities, who didn't have the same capabilities to accumulate wealth in the same way that others have. And so some of these programs are then put in place to then help provide assistance, to then help people get to a level where there's more opportunity for them. And a clear example was in my previous college, I am an alumni from Simon's Rock, and then I transferred to Johns Hopkins for a little while, and I had a professor who was proud to be someone who benefited from affirmative action. He went to the University of Michigan, and he was proud because this idea that without this type of network set up for him, he wouldn't be able to go and get his PhD and become a professor in political science. And so what I did is it helped him, and when he had all these different barriers that prevented him from seeking from attaining that level of education, this affirmative action then helped to propel him forward.
I'm getting my athletics requirements fulfilled.
This is sort of building on that last question, but one thing that I've seen happen is people will see that we have systems like affirmative action and like welfare, and then they will assume that that's enough, that there already is an even playing field based just on that, and then will assume that there doesn't need to be any other work done. And a lot of the, I think, breaking down of privilege comes with a lot of the difficulty from that is the privileged people making some kind of concession or some kind of effort in order to sort of combat the inequality that exists, and then assuming that that minimal effort is enough and that then the fight is over and they don't need to do anything more. So, like, personally, something that affects me a lot is how for a lot of people, particularly straight allies, the fight for LGBT rights has basically stalled out now that gay marriage has been legalized. So I'm just wondering how you can sort of combat the assumption that we can just stop fighting once we reach like some kind of baseline goal and continue to aspire to more equality.
Would you like me to repeat that? So, what Nathaniel was asking is building on the affirmative action question. How do we help people to understand that even if affirmative action is in place, that there's still work to be done? And likewise, for the LGBT community, recognizing that gay marriage has been a major accomplishment, but there's still a lot of work to be done. How do we help people to understand that the work isn't done when just one policy or or one policy is put in place or one goal is achieved.
I mean, I would say that things like affirmative action and welfare aren't like a baseline accomplishment because the primary beneficiaries of affirmative action programs are white women. The primary beneficiaries of welfare in the US are middle-class people, like through mortgage reduction programs. So there's still a lot of work to be done within those steps. I think, and additionally, in order to like show folks that that's not enough, you don't need to look much further than the fact that, you know, trans youth and like Black people are routinely like subject to violence on an everyday basis and are disproportionately imprisoned. These structural inequalities are a lot, you know, they're equally urgent issues when we're talking about like access to education and employment and you know, welfare assistance. We also need to talk about how can we allow people to exist without a fear of you know, facing hate crimes and, you know, state violence in their everyday lives.
I would also add that I think after this election, it was a wake-up call for many of the groups that we're talking about, and what we need to do is really look at how what we consider accomplishments are just building blocks to the next steps that we need to take, not only for, in the case of same-sex marriage, but other groups, and really look at what we can do to work together across different areas of our country where the information is not getting out. And so to the question, what can we do? Personally, my sense of my reaction to the most recent election was a wake-up call to what is not really known about people who are different, and that we need to talk more to each other across our differences to share how we can work to be improving all of our lives together.
I'd like to add something. I guess it's, I mean, I'm sitting on the corner for a reason, like, so nobody hits me hard. I guess I want to sort of complicate the question of baseline in a different way, that maybe some things we have always assumed to be building blocks towards certain things aren't actually building blocks, but they perhaps hurt the movement, you know, they're actual important perspectives that say that gay marriage hurt the queer movement and there was a fundamentally different trajectory on which certain forms of demands were made that weren't about wanting to be part of a particular framework of private property and capital, which is not to say that people's livelihood shouldn't matter, but it would be worth seeing from this point forward whether that presumption of particular straight line through history where we're just basically building on our, like incrementally over on our accomplishments rather than it might be slightly more complicated, where I think what we confront today is not only the result of the oppressor's policies, it's also the result of the things we asked for and we settled with. And I think that's a really crucial thing to always keep in mind in studying the history of social movements, that it's like when we are wanting to say that we are always also writing history, we also have to take responsibility for the things we asked for instead of other things. And I think it's crucial, especially, and I think this is becoming clearer, which policies will remain in place and which will be disrupted. And I think it's worth keeping your eyes open about which, you know, of course, which parts of which forms of agendas will be preserved, such as gay marriage, and what will be taken away, such as abortion. So I think these are much more complicated, intertwined things. These are not politics of getting a little bit for each. They're always interacting in really complicated ways, and I think that's why we need to be much more alert than settled with a path of history that's just going on. Oh, we might stop, we might go back, but it's actually the magnitude of the destruction might not be anything we have come to imagine when we think of affirmative action or welfare or gay marriage as these sort of basic things. And I think I agree with both Avilee and Sabrina, and like that it's just not a question of just a ladder that we're walking up. It's a more complicated path.
Hi. I know that we kind of, here at Simon's Rock, we kind of live in a bubble, and like our politics are more left-leaning than most, but like with the election of Donald Trump and the rise of the alternative right movement, and the sort of radicalization of young men and certain online subcultures, how do you think that we should respond to that sort of this new like paradigm in order to protect marginalized groups and make sure that, and yeah, just to protect people and preserve our rights and stuff?
Would you like me to repeat that? So again, I hope I'm getting this correct. The question is, given, and I'm going to shorten a little bit, given the election of Donald Trump and the sort of emergence or rise to prominence of the alt-right movement, what should we do? What are the strategies for maintaining people's rights and people's safety?
I admire the students on many college campuses who are declaring their fear of fascism given Trump's election. However, no student group should claim to speak for the whole student body. So I admire the groups, the small groups within campuses that have been speaking out about their fears. However, we also have some hopes, and I like what MIT and now Brandeis University have done. MIT chose to put very big butcher paper around 6 columns in one of its stately buildings, tall columns in an Ionic kind of building. 3 of the wrapped columns were headed by magic marker with the words, my hope is. And the 3 others were labeled with, my fear is. And everybody in the community of MIT was invited to come and write on those. It's very healing to read what others are saying. It's not an argument. It's what I would call serial testimony. And I recommend it as a way of speaking your truth at the moment, not pontificating and not arguing so much as expressing your hopes and your fears. So Brandeis is doing it now also. I hope many places will do it. The butcher paper is high. It's about from the ground up to this level. So you see people sometimes kneeling. There's a wonderful, the newspapers have been covering this wonderful picture of a young woman with her backpack, sort of sprawled out and kneeling on the floor, writing her piece. Some write very big, in letters that are a foot tall, and some write in little tiny letters that you have to read closely. I think it's a great public solidarity move to talk about one's hopes and fears in print, in public.
just very briefly, you began by saying we live in a bubble, and I wonder if we do. I wonder if the way that our community tends to vote and tends to articulate a political perspective excuses us or removes us from the patterns that, to my mind, have been of late destructive in at least in our national context. So I guess I want to start thinking about the ways in which Simon's Rock is not a bubble, but is an intersecting point for a lot of what we're seeing also elsewhere.
There are some practical strategies people have been talking about in relation to what it means to protect people who will be extremely exposed in ways that we haven't really confronted, right? And it is not, and I think some of them do require a different relationship to the local, right? That there's a way that, I'm not trying to, it's not just not an axiom in an empty way, but the fact that like all global issues are actually right here with us, and people are mobilizing to have sanctuary schools, right? That like the entire schools should be institutions should protect undocumented migrants, workers, and students, and especially at the level of the city governments, where there have been more progressive city governments, for that to be a stand. Right, so I think that there are real practical things, and some of it, of course, I really appreciate the gesture to like what small spaces of thought and depth will allow, but also they should also empower us to build bigger alliances, right? Like where we might have to work with people who don't desire the same things, right? But because we know our hopes and fears, we aren't just kind of cowered by the fact that somebody else may have something slightly different, because we have expressed what we want. So I think that there are real practical things. So like there isn't, there's a lot to be protected, and there's a lot to be defended from getting worse, right? And I think in the same moment there's a lot to be asked for in a new way that like we have never even asked. Like who could have imagined that we would be in a situation where we have to think about, this is a conversation we've been having since like a few days around the question of international students or the protections that we don't often think certain students need, right? And that might be a new direction in which to get our imaginations going. So I think it's a real time for a lot of good imagination, hope and fear, right? That claiming those things actually allows us to be with people we might even differ from. So it's not always either or. So I think there's real stuff to be done.
I guess kind of like what the provost said, like we're not in a bubble, really, except that like we have like a majority that like represents the culture here, and I guess I don't want everybody to have the same opinions because I think that's kind of destructive in itself, but at the same time the reason like a lot of the people on this campus have the same opinions is because like the difference in education that we get, because even on the same like level, like there's gonna be a difference in opinion for people who are like majoring in economics versus like sociology, and I'm like wondering what steps like we could take for everybody to get that same like base of education, because that leads people towards their opinions. And I know like Diversity Day is one like way, but even then it's like people can cater to what type of education they want to get. So I'm just like wondering like how the school can move like forward from that, and like if we're trying to, and if we could propose some ideas maybe.
Okay, I hear you saying that, which is a term we use a lot here. So I hear you saying, recognizing that we don't want to say that difference is a bad thing, and there is some really good things about people differing, and they differ in majors and areas of study. But how can we work toward getting a campus that has a shared commitment to the kinds of goals and hopes that have been talked about thus far? Is that okay?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question, because I think that is the goal of like the liberal arts, right? Not to homogenize or to get everyone on the same page, but to perhaps like induce that kind of culture. I think I hear you talking about. I think that's what we hope to do with liberal arts at Simon's Rock. I think that's what we hope to do with seminar here. Everyone takes the same 3-semester seminar sequence, and I think like that those classes do offer that potential.
So I think as an institution and as a Simon's Rocker, we all have the ability for once we leave here to kind of share some of the things that we've learned through the seminar classes, through the ways that we debate things, through the ways that we have conversations, and then encourage dialogue. And also this encourages people to further their education and like figure out, okay, so here's my viewpoints, how can then I then articulate, and then how can I have a conversation with someone else? So I think as an institution, we can do that, kind of branch out into the community, but then also just as Simon's Rockers ourselves, we can then go out into different environments and then kind of bring along some of the values that we hold and have conversations to try to develop community and relationships around that. Like I know that when I transferred, I learned a lot at Simon's Rock that I brought with me, a lot that helped me to interact with students, to help me in my classes, to help me figure out, okay, so how do I then interact in an environment where people have different viewpoints than I do? How can I navigate that so it's not hostile, but then yet so that we can have a conversation and figure out, okay, so what can we do together?
And I'll just add quickly that President Botstein, my very interesting boss, said after the election that what it was primarily was a failure of education, of the American educational system. And I just want to note that Simon's Rock is very unlike other small liberal arts colleges, not only in being early, but in making a sustained effort to do what we do here in urban and, in many cases, high poverty contexts in public education. Bard and Simon's Rock operate early college programs in public school districts in 5 cities around the country, and we're trying to do more. So there are lots of opportunities for you guys to get involved in that work. Simon's Rock is the hub of that network.
Hello, sorry, I was letting you know when I cough. Would you guys mind talking about language and language privilege and how that manifests itself within the country? You could talk about it globally. You could talk about it, am I too close? Maybe. You could talk about it from the perspective of people who have a first language that is considered a language of power or a language of privilege. Or you could talk about it from the perspective of what languages are desirable to learn and what languages are considered valuable to learn. I'd be interested in that. Maybe my thesis, maybe just interest. Thank you.
So I hear you saying that, asking a question about how is it that language plays a role in privilege, particularly dominant or predominant language or assumed sort of languages in which education or other things should be conducted. So again, how does language play into privilege? You want me to say that again?
The person raising this matter said more than you did.
Yes.
So I want to hear all of what she said, but you need to put to reach my old ears, she'll need to speak with the mic right up to her mouth.
Well, I give a kiss to whoever follows me. Is this better? No, I'm not asking you. Yeah. I'm going to commit blasphemy into the microphone.
So the question as paraphrased is, what role does language play in privilege?
What role does language play in privilege, both as a native or heritage language, sorry, but also as languages that we decide are desirable to learn? What languages are good to learn and we see as good to learn? So it could be either within academia or it could be within the languages and heritage languages that we consider to be languages of power. Yeah.
Well, the language of the heart is the hardest. It's to find the words for what you really feel. And the words aren't available yet. They're not in any language that anybody's written. That's why Emily Dickinson, your distant neighbor here in Western Massachusetts, refused the punctuation she was taught and basically revised the vocabulary she was taught because neither was sufficiently complicated for her or ethereal for her sense of things. She wanted everything to be more clear, but also more spiritual. So the language of the heart is what we derive from our own experience. It is very hard not to be wooed by the existing phraseology, the existing academic habits of not revealing yourself in a formal academic work. So that's the language that's most necessary for us to relate as humans. And it's quite apart from election rhetoric and repeated phrases, which you hope will get you votes. But I'm not sure whether you were asking about the learning of other languages as literally. That is it for equity, is it better to learn French than to learn English? Is that what did you also mean that? Because that one's very interesting, but I'm not sure that's what you meant.
It is. This is so silly. It is the one that I meant, and I mean languages, like how we prioritize English and English-only education policies growing out of the 1980s and English-only education groups, things like that.
Right. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is learn Chinese. Chinese has no word for he or she. And my Chinese colleague, my favorite Chinese colleague, keeps getting it wrong because she's trying to speak in English and she doesn't have either he or she upmost in her mind. So she'll misuse these phrases when she's looking at me. She'll call me he. I think this is very refreshing that she doesn't have the binary that I was raised with. About French, it's fascinating to me that if you have a whole class full of women, they are L-E-L-L-E-S, but as soon as one man enters and sits down, suddenly the whole class becomes he's, I-L-S, he's. It's a takeover, and it's very interesting to me that can happen, and it can't happen in Chinese because they don't have these gender-associated pronouns. So, what to learn? I'd say first the language of the heart. Second, revere anybody who's bilingual. They're doubly smart. But I was taught that the aristocracy, the people like us, are superior because we only know English. And it's as though other languages have contaminated the people who spoke them. But no, anybody who's truly bilingual is doubly smart. So this is a question of learning from those you were taught to look down on. If you're like me, you were taught to look down on bilingual people. Instead, I do ask questions like, what can you think in Spanish that you can't think in English? And I listen for the answers, learning from the person who knows two languages, stuff that I can't imagine.
So, my question is about just talking to people in general, and there are times when people are confronted with their racism, with their sexism, with their privilege, and may have a reaction to it which is more flippant and sort of dismissive, perhaps even claiming that the person who's calling them out is oversensitive. So I'm wondering what you would sort of suggest for us to
do in those situations? How do we engage these people in conversations when they don't truly understand in or believe in the structures that oppress people? How do we talk to them? How do we address them?
So the question is, when people say something that is racist or sexist or in otherwise offensive, and we confront them, they often say we're being oversensitive or we misunderstood or I'm going to add in, can't take a joke. So how do we talk to people and help them to understand the impact of what they've said and to really recognize what they've said rather than deny it?
Give it to Gwendolyn.
So my answer to that question really is about the other person. If someone says they're hurt, the other person should be willing to hear that. So that's my first response. It's really not your job to convince them. I think your job is really just to say, this has this impact on me, so that you are not internalizing it yourself. And then we hope that we're building a community that people will listen and care about that and respond. So it's not your burden to explain it. It's really my answer.
I would just add that what I learned in a counseling class around this issue was to say, when you say that, it makes me feel. And so take ownership of how that feeling, how those words have made you feel. And when, it doesn't always work, but I do find that if I really focus on helping the person understand how I'm feeling about what was said, or if it's about someone else that I'm hearing words that are offensive, even if I'm not in that group, I can relate to the feeling in some way. And I find that if we use I words, that sometimes helps in a conversation. And then I have to admit, I do tend to, especially with family and friends, I will usually follow up with something in writing, whether it's an article or some other reading that I find helpful that I ask them to consider reading, just to help broaden. That's just the educator in me, that I find that sharing information can sometimes help too, when they're in their own private space, to read something that might change their view.
So those are all really good tactics, and it's important to do those things, and I'm going to ask Peggy to speak to a little bit about the privilege dynamic in that. You know, it's great to educate, and if you want to, it's really good, and there's ways to not accuse, you know, which is what Kathy's talking about. But I think that the shift that we have to make here is that there is a dominant way of thinking and being, and that it's not the people that are being oppressed job to be explaining it all of the time. I mean, we live it and it's pretty apparent, and I think just being able to own where you are and express that in a careful way is really what I would say to anyone that feels like they're being oppressed, you know. And then the other side of that is that we're in community together and we're really asking the other people to do their work, their self-education, and their understanding. There shouldn't be anyone, if you're saying I'm hurt, that they're like, what are you talking about? That's just not a human, compassionate response.
Yes, it doesn't work to say to somebody that's racist. A description of how it makes you feel is more effective. In addition, I keep thinking of this dynamic. People who were born to power, racially, ethnically, religiously, and gender-wise, are likely to think of themselves as good people. Now, that's not their fault. They were raised to think of themselves as good people, and also as normal people. That's not their fault. That is the systemic teaching in privilege, in all those categories that I mentioned. So I just heard a young man make a homophobic comment tonight. I kind of blew it off, but said, what does it matter? Then I wondered, should I have gotten up on my high horse and said to him, this kind of thinking is too prevalent around here, and I'm really uncomfortable with it. Or should I have continued with my dinner? And I continued with my dinner, not knowing what to do. I'm an outsider. At the same time, I felt the norm of heterosexuality in the air. And I believe with Botstein that the recent education signals a failure of the educational system of the United States. I've been saying that, and I didn't realize he said it too. So I'm glad to hear him formulate it that way. But I keep thinking on the humane level, we have been very good students of what we've been taught by our rather poisonous systems. And so when we individually hurt others, I don't yet have the answer I want. It's something like, I know I was taught to think that too, or I was taught to say that too. I want to make common cause with all these people who were taught they were good while being quite oppressive. So I haven't yet found that language.
It's a hard thing to do, but then I also think it's important for people of privilege to then be able to speak up too and kind of help link that. If we go back to Cracking the Codes that we watched earlier this year, where they talked about the instance of the grocery store, where you had the sister and the sister-in-law who one looked more white than the other, and then they were not checked for, the cashier didn't ask to check their ID for when they had written a check. But then for the person who looked more African-American, they were checking the ID and going through the book of people who had fraudulent checks. And so what this does is then you have an outside perspective of people looking in and going, this doesn't seem right. And then have a unity of speaking out. Sometimes it's hard to speak up by yourself, especially when you're in a group. But then to kind of show that solidarity or show that you maybe coming from privilege, coming from an instance where you want to speak up and say, this doesn't seem right to me. And so it's hard to then take everything. And I have instances too to where I encounter things and I'm like, should I address this? Maybe not. But then if there was someone else there to kind of help with that, then it kind of helps. So it's encouraging people to speak up. And I encourage everyone to speak up. If you see something that's not right, to then say something. Not in a necessarily mean way, but then to kind of have a conversation about it.
Hi. So, in what ways on campus or in general can those with male privilege use our advantages to make a more inclusive and equal environment for others?
How can those who are male, and therefore have masculine or male privilege use that advantage or that privilege to change things?
I'm going to quote one of our alums, Alison Bechtel, who has a Bechtel test that she has coined for movies, where if two women are actually talking to each other, or they're in a, well, you all know this theory. My point is this: men on campus can think about that Bechdel test and look in your circles, in your classrooms, and look around to make sure that the women at the table, first of all, make sure there are women at the table. Second, make sure they're being asked to be part of the conversation. It's a simple thing we can do to look to see who's sitting with us and are we inclusive and engaging with men and women. And that's one simple thing as a woman, do ask men to just look at the room, make sure there is a female voice when you can make that happen.
And I think beyond voices, something that's really important to me is like labor, especially on this campus. I think women's labor is often really devalued, and so thinking about who's doing labor, whether that's in like group work in a class, in like a committee that you're serving on, in a club you're a part of, like who are the people who are doing the labor, whose labor is being recognized, because maybe even like the labor is actually evenly divided, but only the male's labor is being recognized. And I think that's something I've seen a lot in my experiences as a student here. And so just recognizing women's labor when you see it, taking on labor yourself, calling into question like those formations, I think is really important.
I just want to add to Kathy and Nathan that I often think, and it's something Gwendolyn does really well, right, but just sort of reminding us in terms of all privilege to think of being accountable to someone other than yourself. And something I think like the way we try to read texts also kind of has, like cultivates an ethic of thinking about someone other than yourself. That perhaps there's more than an idea of having voices be included, but that the question of labor and voice together is really a question of accountability, right? Are there people in your immediate circle who you hang out with or who you think of every day that like you even connect like with what's happening to their life, right? And basic little practices of empathy, but also just practices of, again, accountability, that I'm here for you and I can account for my existence in this way to you because it's connected to yours, right? If we never meet, it's nobody's fault if they've never met a black person in their life and don't know what to do with it, if they grew up in, central Pennsylvania, right? But once they get out of there, who will help the fact that like maybe in their circle as they grow up, there will be one or two more people who aren't like them, about whom they have to think before they go to bed, and what better way to do that than on this campus, right? Like your lives are entwined with each other in a way that it doesn't have to be an acknowledgement, a confession of your privilege all the time. What if you were actually accounting for something, right? Being accountable to someone, because I think even the confession of privilege can only go so far, because that becomes your own voice, right? It becomes like, oh, you put your voice in and it's done. How do we account to someone else, right? How are we accountable? I think that's the piece you do so well in the race circle and Housatonic, that like, who else is in your group to whom you are accountable to? I think that's a key piece.
People ask, how can I use my white skin privilege? What can I do? And you've raised the question of male privilege, and bless you for that. And you have about 4 times the power I have, just by being a man, to make change in the society. I do not think it's your obligation. I differ from some of my colleagues on this. Some of my colleagues think that if you have any kind of privilege, you are obliged to work against the privilege system that gave it to you. I don't believe that. It depends on your values. But as you think, well, what kind of a world do I want to live in, and what do I want to do to be part of that world? You may find that you like the world pretty much as it is. And I think that that's a freedom in the United States. You don't need to use your male privilege on any particular thing. It's up to you, whether you would like to. And the society is free to that extent. But bless you for raising the question.
I also just want to remind us that when we're talking about male privilege, we're probably also talking about like cis male privilege. So I want us to remember also that, when we're talking about male privilege and we're talking about what can I do for women, to not forget that like trans women are women too, and that that trans men may or may not have like male privilege in the same way that a cis male has the same thing. So just remember that when we're trying to use our privilege for others, to not just think about like what we prototypically consider to be like the opposite group, but the intersections of demographics that we should also be thinking about, because those intersections can make them invisible, and I want to make sure the invisible become visible.
Another question?
There was another answer.
I think it's also important to understand what these privileges are and how they affect others. And so even if we do choose to not act on those, or then to help kind of negate some of the privileges, but just to understand the implications they have on other people, and to fully grasp and just continue to always educate yourself. So, okay, so what privileges do I have for me just being me? And then how does then that play out and affect others? And it's always good to have that type of almost like self-reflection.
My question to you is, until I came into Simon's Rock, I had no idea about like the LGBT community, and I was never even taught about like social justice or anything in schools. Do you believe that learning about these things should be mandatory in schools in regard to the U.S. School system?
So the question is that this student was saying that she came to Simon's Rock not really having been exposed or to even the notion of an LGBT community or the issue of privilege. And so the question is, should this kind of learning be mandatory in U.S. schools? In all U.S. schools.
Is that correct? Let's each in turn, without explanation, give a yes or a no to that question. No explanation, just yes.
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 I didn't allow for the category, I don't know. You want to redo your answer? My answer is, I don't know.
My answer is in the affirmative, yes.
I would say yes.
I would say yes.
Yeah, so I kind of want to say no. I'm not sure that like much of anything should be like mandated in some sense in terms of education. I think it really is a question of like what we are accountable to as educators. And I think, yeah, as educators, we should have an accountability towards certain people in our classrooms, in our schools, in our worlds. And I think that often does require teaching about things like that. I think that like begins an answer. I think it also, I mean, it depends on like, yeah, I don't, it's not, I guess I'm not sure it's a simple yes or no question in any sense of it at all. I think like the curriculum has like more complexities.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll just add on to what you mean by teaching social justice. I guess, like, are we talking about teaching history? Are we inculcating certain values? Are we talking about, like, having a shared curriculum that says, like, let's actually tell the truth about this country? I mean, and what people then do with it, you know, is up to them. But I think, yeah, absolutely, the question of what people should know about the history, and without the idea that somehow everyone's always being taught to think a certain way. Yeah, I think. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not saying that.
And the whole point should not be that this is a social justice class. It should be everything, right? Like I think that's where the attention would be, that it's not like your social justice component of the curriculum. The same way as, yeah, we shouldn't have a cultural perspectives portion of the curriculum, because all of the curriculum should be that way. So that would be an answer, you know, perhaps.
Yeah, so I guess I just wanted to sort of get the answer is like saying, like social justice like should be mandated in education, like that's one thing, and that's different than I guess mandating like teaching about specific, like, yeah.
I'll just say really quick. No, we should be teaching our, everyone in any type of educational setting to be a global citizen. And that's just where I'm coming from with that. There are many different types of people in the world, and if we want to teach like critical thought, we should be teaching, that there are many different people that think in many different ways and come from many different, like regions and demographics and whatnot, and we should be exposed.
I don't want to endanger teachers. Parents often go ballistic if you teach their child about privilege. They think of themselves as good people and you are ruining their relation with their children. But this is what I think for sure. If any teacher is to talk about racism, it is crazy to think you can do anything to end racism without facing privilege. It is the upside of racism, and it is what causes racism. So it's crazy to do any teaching about racism without engaging with what causes it, which is white over advantage. That part I'm sure of. The I don't know on my part comes from the fact that Rush Limbaugh has said, I have ruined education in the United States. And he suggested when he was broadcasting from Texas that somebody come up north and take me out. So I live with that and continue to get threats like that. I don't want to endanger teachers. It depends, for me it depends on whether or not the teaching about privilege should be mandated in all schools in all places.
Thank you for that, and I'm glad for the chance to inflect my answer. I'm a little bit mad at everybody to my left. We followed the assignment at great peril. In answering the question, I was thinking about what I think should and shouldn't be regulated in education, and I think this is a very complicated question. I think what is regulated reinforces privilege and exclusion. That is standardized test scores. That is what is and isn't in curricula. I think that as long as there's regulation in education, which there is and possibly should be, maybe a good thing to be that our structures should be looking at is whether education is inclusive. And that, I think, should be the case across at least our public schools.
I definitely agree with Eve and Renee, and I do believe that we should all be global citizens. And I also do believe that it's important then, because people can go throughout their lives not understanding their privilege if they're not put in situations to where they will have to take courses that will then help them assess what their like basically their life is like, or like what privileges they were given just from being born, or the experiences that they have. So I definitely am still an affirmative yes in terms of giving people the opportunity to then experience knowledge, but then also to then experience and then to learn about differences in privilege, differences in race, differences in culture. Still a big yes for me.
I don't like the word mandatory. It sounds like it's always in reference to something that people don't want to do or that feels like a chore, and I don't think that we should view education that includes an analysis of systems of privilege and oppression as a chore or something that is burdensome to learn, because I think that our knowledge of those systems affects how we interact with others every day, and we should be working to allow space for those conversations.
How about 2 more questions, does that sound? 2 more?
We have our 2.
So I asked this question sort of earlier, so I apologize because I'm asking it to you again, but I'm still not quite satisfied and it keeps coming up. So I wanted to ask it. This idea of using your privilege to help underprivileged groups as a solution just seems really troublesome to me because it's contingent upon the oppressive structure. And so I'm just wondering about ways in which we can move beyond that sort of still thinking within, like racism, for example, and using white privilege to help other groups of people. It seems like something that is important. It is sort of a temporary, like Band-Aid type deal. But how can we move beyond, like, perpetuating the system, like, while trying to help?
Okay, the question is, or the concern is that in talking about using, or people who are in privileged positions or privileged groups using their privilege as a vehicle for addressing privilege or addressing inequity and inequality, by framing this around using the privileged position to make these changes, we're still staying within that privileged dynamic, and sort of it feels like this doesn't make real structural change. You use the language of calling it sort of a Band-Aid on the problem rather than really trying to sort of challenge the systems that have brought about privilege versus non-privilege. Sound okay?
I would say being an ally and supporting the goals and hopes of marginalized groups instead of trying to come in and then determine what they would need as a group to then help them, but then supporting the goals that they're pushing forward to and being an ally.
I think of Audre Lorde's quote in response to you, and I might not say the words exactly, but it's basically you can't dismantle the master's house with master's tools. So I feel that feels like a reflection of what you were asking earlier today and now. And I agree with that. And but I also think that people can abuse their privilege in their allyship, or they can use it for good in the way that Sabrina's talking about. So there has to be an entry point. So a person, if it's an all-white group or an all-dominant group, saying this other person should be here and their voice should be heard is a positive way to use their privilege, and that's important. But when you're really talking about dismantling structures and policies and deciding then what's needed, you do need other voices and other visions and perspectives that have never even been considered.
Yeah, so there's a phrase that Gayatri Spivak often writes about, and she says, unlearning one's privilege as one's loss. And it's a complicated phrase because it's not necessarily saying that like somehow you can shed it, that unlearning just means like reframing what was a privilege as a loss, so you have somehow equalized the terrain. Right? But what it does mean, like connected to the question on education, that there is something much more, as much as education requires so much embodied hard work, right, challenging ourselves, that the unlearning also requires what sorts of shedding of layers of our presumptions, right? It would be hard work. But there's something, I think, what bothers me in the totality of thinking about, right, the all tools, all of the house, like, but what are the tools? Like, I'd love to talk about what are the tools that the master has used, right? Maybe to dismantle the house, we will not use the language the master used, but we'll use language, right? Maybe to dismantle the house, we will feel differently, but we will still feel, you know? We will forgive, but forgive different things, you know? So I'm just thinking that there's a complexity, like not complex in the sense that it's kind of inscrutable, but there is a specificity to the question of what will dismantle, right? Because there are things that change when somebody behaves not like a jerk,
right? There are things that change when somebody doesn't walk on the earth as if this was built for them. So those small things aren't inconsequential. I just think that the grand question of like, oh, what is the strategy, is already a cop-out. There's no grand strategy, right? Like colonization wasn't a grand strategy. It was lots of bullshit mistakes, like lots of bad planning, lots of terrible things people just like did to like ease their anger, ease their anxiety in the world that produced the world we're producing. Do we want to be those? Are those the tools we have? No, I don't have fear. I don't work in the world through anxiety of like somebody else's power all the time. I use the language like I want to. Why aren't those tools we can use to dismantle the privilege? Like, you know, so I think, yeah, I also don't think you create a theory and then apply. One always learns, like, you know, we study theory, but life doesn't happen applying concepts. We live them, you know, and that's what learning theory or like reading things or reading plays or embodying those things actually helps us like make certain things real. So I just think that the bizarre conceit that we have to figure out a plan or that it's a grand strategy which will then somehow unfold to change the world. You know, we were watching a movie yesterday. We watch movies, right? Like we change the world by seeing differently. I mean, there's this whole work that's happening with indigenous nations right now that's really saying you have to disrupt the visual order of settler colonialism. What does that mean? It seems like a complex phrase, but you have to learn to see differently, right? So will you stop seeing because the master was seeing? No, right? You see differently. And those are counter struggles. Those are things that have always changed the world. And you know, the film we were watching said, wow, it took 7 years of Algerian anti-colonial movements produced more intellectuals in Algeria than 150 years of colonial rule, right? Because something was happening in the world to which people responded. They saw their own people think, they saw their own people get into stuff. So I think in that sense, I would rather just make the question of privilege less theoretical as much as it seems to be so concrete. I think maybe let's go down to the question of what are we refusing to pick up? You know, what tools seem so, you know, kind of marked that you are so kind of weak to change. I think we have more power than that.
In my lifetime, I've seen white men make dramatic changes in whole structures. One time was during the New Deal in the 1930s, when Franklin D. Roosevelt, with the help of Eleanor, conceived the major programs such as Social Security. I've also seen white men threaten to dismantle such programs, as Trump has done with both Obamacare and Social Security, threatening to privatize them and take them out of the public sphere. I've also seen white men make a very positive policy decision that affected us and Europe after World War II, making the Marshall Plan, in which we would benefit the people who had been our enemies. We would build up the nations who had opposed us. So I think that it's very important to use whatever place you're stationed at, to use your power, if you want, in ways that will change structures. At the school I went to, which was a Quaker school in Pennsylvania, the men who were in charge noticed that men kept getting all the school offices, so they made a policy, structural decision using their male privilege. They decided that every single office in the school must be held by a boy and a girl. That's what we were called in those days, or a male and a female. It worked. The school graduated many, many women who had confidence and many, many men who have respect for women. It was a structural change made by white males.
So we've talked a lot today about, you know, what sort of changes we can make just by talking to each other, but I know that I feel sometimes as an early college student that I'm kind of helpless when it comes to really wanting to support things on a bigger, more political scale. Like, I don't have the income to donate to charities. I don't even have the ability to vote or drive myself to a protest, but I want to help and I want to support movements that I believe in. So what options do you think we have as people who care but are still young?
A little bit to the first question. I had a lot to say about that question, but I wanted to hear from others, and as somebody on stage that sort of communicates quite a lot of privilege, I think sometimes it's about listening, and not speaking. I do have something specific to say about this, and I think that there are ways that you can be sort of directly engaged and involved as a younger person or a person under 18, college student or early college student or whatever. But I also think it's extremely important that we give ourselves the time to equip ourselves for the work that we want to do, right? And that itself is part of the work. It's good to be here and doing that work, I'd like to see all of us try to avoid misgivings about the value of doing that work.
I have a response about what we can do. Here's the Berkshire Eagle, and when I opened it this morning, I found 3 letters to the editor that I agreed with. So I have a whole box of cards that say thank you on the cover of the card, and then it's blank inside. And I just say, I appreciate your letter to the editor in today's Berkshire Eagle. I have no particular power in doing this, but this person gets a handwritten statement that their work mattered. And as a woman, I do a lot of that helping from the side rather than from the top down. Thanking people for what they've done. It's very gratifying. They usually write back.
So I also just want to add that we are in the age of social media. So you have to also consider that you can start a blog, I think they're called YouTube channels or something, if they're like just yours. I don't have one. No. You have like your friends on Facebook, you can respond, to them. You can use your Facebook post instead of saying, hey, just landed at home, you can post an article. That's what people post. I know one person that posts like in their car, they're like take a picture like while they're driving. It's completely unsafe, but that's what they're posting. They're like do live while they're driving. Don't do that. Instead, be safe, people. And instead, like you could use that status update to say something regarding social justice. This came up in a class recently, so I demonstrated in the class while also demonstrating the topic for the day. And in the class, I brought my new planner that I had gotten from this company called Passion Planner. And basically, I noticed as I was going through each week in my planner, I really, really like the planner, is that with each week there's a quote. So in class, we went through the entire planner and basically ticked off how many quotes were from men and women of each different racial category that popped up. There are way too many quotes that were from white men. It was 52 weeks out of the year, I think 30 were from white men. Sasha, thank you. Sasha's confirming it because Sasha was in the class. That demonstrates this idea that our great speakers, our great inspirational people are white men. And I'm like, I beg to differ. And I said that what I'm going to do over Thanksgiving break, because that's when I have time, is I'm going to compose a very kindly worded letter pointing out this issue to the people who create Passion Planner. And specifically say, this is what we found out in the class, this is how many were white men, this is how many were white women. I don't think we had any black men at all, no black women. We did have was it Asian proverb? Yes. I kid you not. I think we had Gandhi twice. But you could see, like, after 30, there's only so many weeks left in the year. And I think that's problematic, so I'm going to write a letter to the company, and that's just something that I can do in order to, like, make some change. And that's a change that, if they decide to take it on, would go to anyone who has a passion planner, which I actually recommend. It's a really cool planner. That's the only drawback. Of the planner itself is who they chose to be the quotes, but that's something that I noticed, and because I noticed it, I wanted to do something about it.
And are you saying all the students here could equivalently write letters on what concerns them?
Exactly.
Everyone, without exception.
Yes, we could all write letters.
We could all write letters on anything. My sister and I lobbied Crayola crayons for their flesh-colored crayon color, but then lobbied them when they made a cheap little fake multicultural crayon box of 8 colors, and there were 4 browns that they just chose from their usual tree bark and sand browns, and then they added black and white. Why? For mixing, they said. And we said, this is cynical, go to the cosmetic count. Now, you may say, I don't have that kind of clout, but you do. You have this knowledge that if they would go to the cosmetic counters in Boston, Chicago, LA, Austin, Texas, and bought the actual foundation colors that women purchase to match their skin, well, then they could make a crayon box that was approximating human skin colors of many kinds. And guess what? We won. And now there is the 16-color skin tone box. They've still got black and white for hair. They stopped faking it, that you could mix black and white to make a skin tone. And there's also green and blue for eyes that aren't brown. And we're proud of that, and we harangued them, and you can harangue them too.
I guess. So I think something that, is often felt by students here is, right, like stuff happens far away, right? So there's going to be a protest in DC at Trump's inauguration, and maybe that's not something you can feel you can get to. And I think along with that idea comes with the idea that, like, we live in some sort of bubble here, and I think both of those things aren't true, right? I think there's work to be done on this campus and this school around issues of social justice. There's ways you can just, like, live your lives, right, with an accountability to someone else, to something else, that changes the people around you, I think. You will leave here one day, there's work to be done elsewhere. I think there's just ways to, like, figure out, how to participate in movements today, right now, both online. It's not just making Facebook posts, it's not just writing letters. Like, movements happen on social media in different ways than that as well. And I think that's really important to recognize and to see. And some of it is also doing, like, there's critical work you can do here while you're a student that maybe you actually won't be able to do when you're no longer a student. And I think sometimes that's important.
There's a great sentence that ended one of the readings we did in our workshop today, which was that the invitation to solidarity is a favor to you. Like, you're not, like, the fact that somebody invites solidarity with their cause is not a favor to them. Ultimately, it makes you a better person, or, like, it's a chance to be something that we would never be, right? So just responding to a call, like, to be, as Sabrina said, an ally, or, like, something more. I'm a particular fan of the word comrade because of my history. Ally doesn't mean that much to me. I want you to be a friend or comrade. real flesh and blood, put your body next to mine, right? And that, I just think that that's a privilege, actually, that we should all very happily take over, to be invited to that relation to someone else. So don't think it's a favor to someone, it's a favor to us.
Do we have time for any more questions at this point? Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much for coming. I think we promised to end at 6, and it's 6. So we only got through 10 questions or comments, but thank you very much.